November 1743, 25,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Technical Sergeant Roy Holbert's hands gripped the ice-cold metal of his 50 caliber machine guns as he scanned the horizon for German fighters. The temperature outside the B-17 flying fortress, nicknamed Steel Rain, registered -58 degrees. Inside his oxygen mask, Holbert's breath formed tiny ice crystals with each laboured exhale. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through the scratched plexiglass of his top turret position, Holbert watched as the formation of American bombers pressed deeper into German airspace. Lieutenant James Donovan, the 23-year-old pilot from Chicago, kept Steel Rain steady in the formation as they approached their target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, responsible for producing some of the Fechtereface of the Luftwaffe, Luftwaffe's deadliest fighters. The factory had become a priority target for the 8th Air Force, which was suffering devastating losses in the air war over Europe. In the 11 months since American heavy bombers had joined the strategic bombing campaign, the harsh reality of daylight precision bombing had become clear. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers were vulnerable to German interceptors that would pick them apart before they could reach their targets deep in German territory. Fighters, 3 o'clock high. The warning crackled through the interphone as waist gunner Sergeant Frank Coletti spotted the first wave of German interceptors. 11 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters emerged from the scattered clouds, their noses glinting in the winter sunlight as they lined up for their attack run. "All gunners, stand ready," ordered Donovan, his voice betraying no emotion despite the mortal danger approaching. "Remember your training. Short bursts. Lead your targets." The 1350 caliber machine guns distributed across Steel Rain swiveled toward the incoming threat. Each gunner knew what was at stake. In the previous week's mission over Schweinfurt, 60 American bombers had been lost, 600 young airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The odds of completing a 25-mission tour were becoming mathematically impossible. The first wave of German fighters attacked from the front, a tactic designed to disrupt the bomber formation and separate the vulnerable stragglers. Tracers streaked across the sky as the bombers' forward guns opened fire. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant William Hayes gripped his twin 50 calibers and fired at the rapidly approaching fighters, their propellers spinning into deadly blurs as they closed the distance. "Here they come," shouted ball turret gunner Corporal Eddie Malinowski, his voice strained as he rotated his isolated glass bubble beneath the aircraft's belly, tracking a Focke-Wulf that dived beneath the formation. The distinctive hammering of his guns joined the cacophony as all 13 of Steel Rain's machine guns opened fire. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary air combat encounters of the Second World War. Over the next 17 minutes, Steel Rain would withstand 11 separate fighter attacks. The Germans, expecting the standard evasive maneuvers, were unprepared for Donovan's aggressive defensive tactics. "Keep firing, don't let up," Donovan commanded as he jerked the bomber into a tight turn, breaking the standard formation protocol. The maneuver was dangerous. Bombers stayed in formation for mutual protection, but Donovan had recognized that the German fighters were focusing their attacks on Steel Rain specifically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During the third attack run, top turret gunner Holbert tracked a Messerschmitt that came straight at them from 12 o'clock high. His 50 calibers pumped out 500 rounds per minute as the fighter grew larger in his sights. Suddenly, smoke erupted from the German aircraft's engine. The fighter rolled inverted and plunged toward the earth, trailing black smoke. "Got one," Holbert called out, but there was no time for celebration as two more fighters immediately took its place. In the waist position, Sergeant Coletti and Corporal Daniel Witkowski stood back to back, their guns blazing at fighters attacking from both sides simultaneously. The noise was deafening, the roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, the hammering of multiple 50-caliber machine guns, and the terrifying sound of German cannon shells tearing through aluminum skin. "Fighter at 7 o'clock, Witkowski yelled as he swung his gun toward a Focke-Wulf diving from above, his tracers connected with the fighter's wing route. The German aircraft shuddered, flames erupting from its fuel tanks as it rolled into an uncontrolled dive. "That's 2, radio operator Technical Sergeant Harold Jenkins announced, keeping tally of their defensive success. But the situation was growing dire. Steel Rain had become separated from the main formation, making it an even more tempting target for the German interceptors. During the 6th fighter pass, a 20mm cannon shell exploded in the radio compartment, wounding Jenkins and damaging critical communications equipment. Shrapnel peppered the fuselage, and the temperature inside the bomber plummeted as frigid air rushed through dozens of new holes in the aircraft's skin. "Status report," Donovan called over the interphone, struggling to keep the damaged bomber level as another wave of fighters approached. "Radio compartment hit but operational," Jenkins reported through gritted teeth, blood freezing on his oxygen mask where shrapnel had caught his cheek. "Tail, position good," responded Staff Sergeant Malcolm Reed from the tail gunner's position, where he had the best view of the fighters coming up from behind. 2 more bandits at 6 o'clock. The 7th and 8th attack runs came simultaneously, fighters converging from multiple angles. The coordinated German assault was designed to overwhelm the bombers' defences, forcing the gunners to divide their attention. But what the Germans hadn't counted on was the extraordinary marksmanship of Steel Rain's crew, many of whom had been hunters and competitive shooters in civilian life. Ball turret gunner Malinowski, cramped in his spherical prison beneath the aircraft, tracked a Messerschmitt that attempted to attack from directly below. Despite the limited traverse of his position, he caught the fighter with a perfect burst as it crossed beneath them. The German pilot never saw the stream of incendiary rounds that tore through his cockpit canopy. 3 down, Malinowski called out, his voice betraying both exhilaration and terror. The 9th attack came from a trio of Focke-Wulfs that approached in tight formation from 3 o'clock high. They coordinated their attack to saturate Steel Rain with cannon fire, gambling that the American gunners couldn't engage all 3 simultaneously. They were wrong. In a display of coordination that would later be studied at gunnery school, Holbert, Coletti, and Navigator Lieutenant Michael Donoghue concentrated their fire on the lead aircraft while Witkowski and Hayes engaged the trailing fighters. The lead Focke-Wulf's engine erupted in flames, forcing the pilot to break off his attack. The disruption threw off the timing of the other 2 fighters, causing their cannon rounds to miss the bomber entirely. 4, Jenkins called out, still keeping score despite his wounds. By the 10th fighter pass, Steel Rain was showing the cumulative effects of sustained combat. The No. 3 engine was running rough, its cowling riddled with bullet holes. The hydraulic system had been damaged, meaning the ball turret couldn't be rotated electrically. Malinowski was hand-cranking his position to track targets. Oxygen lines had been severed in multiple locations, forcing several crew members to switch to emergency bottles with limited supply. Yet somehow, the bomber kept flying and its guns kept firing. During the 11th and final attack, a Messerschmitt made the fatal mistake of approaching too directly from the tail position. Sergeant Reed, blood streaming from a cut above his eye where a spent shell casing had struck him, held his fire until the fighter filled his gun sight. His burst caught the German aircraft in the radiator, sending coolant streaming behind it in a visible white plume. 5. Jenkins announced as the German fighter rolled over and descended, its engine seizing without coolant, and then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the German fighters broke off their attack, whether due to fuel constraints, ammunition depletion, or the shocking loss of 5 of their number. The remaining interceptors turned back toward their bases. "All stations report," Donovan called, his voice hoarse from shouting commands over the interphone for nearly 20 minutes. The damage assessment was sobering. Over 300 bullet and cannon holes perforated the aircraft. The number 3 engine was producing only 60% power. The radio equipment was severely damaged. 3 crew members had sustained wounds, though none life-threatening. Oxygen was running low. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple severed lines. "Can we make it back to England?" Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Callahan asked, surveying the devastation around them. Donovan checked their position. They were still more than 400 miles from their base at Thorpe Abbotts. "We're going to find out," he replied grimly. As steel rain limped westward, the crew worked frantically to address the damage. Jenkins patched oxygen lines with electrical tape. Flight engineer Technical Sergeant Walter Novak crawled through the bomb bay to transfer fuel from the tanks feeding the damaged engine. Gunners redistributed ammunition to positions that still had functional guns. When they finally crossed back into Allied airspace over the North Sea, the crew allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. Donovan had nursed the damaged bomber for hours, compensating for the loss of power and the compromised control surfaces with subtle adjustments that kept them airborne. The landing at Thorpe Abbotts would become legendary. With hydraulics damaged, the landing gear had to be lowered manually using the emergency crank system. Flaps were inoperative. The number 3 engine finally failed completely on final approach. Despite these challenges, Donovan put steel rain down in one of the smoothest landings of his career. As the ground crew approached the battle-damaged bomber, their expressions shifted from concern to astonishment. Chief Mechanic Master Sergeant Harold Wilson circled the aircraft slowly, counting bullet holes and shaking his head in disbelief. "How in God's name did you get this thing home?" he asked Donovan as the exhausted crew descended the ladder. The answer came not from the pilot, but from ball turret gunner Malinovsky, who patted his gun affectionately. 1350 cals and a lot of prayers, he said simply. The engagement would later be analysed by 8th Air Force intelligence officers, who initially disbelieved the crew's claim of downing 5 fighters. Aerial combat reports were notoriously exaggerated, with multiple gunners often claiming the same kill. But when gun camera footage from other bombers in the formation was reviewed, it confirmed Steel Rain's extraordinary achievement. German records captured after the war revealed the rest of the story. The Luftwaffe had intercepted an American radio transmission identifying Steel Rain as carrying an important intelligence officer. The fighter controller had ordered his interceptors to focus their attacks on this specific aircraft, believing its destruction would yield both tactical and psychological advantages. What the Germans couldn't know was that this was deliberate misinformation. There was no intelligence officer aboard. The Americans had planted the false transmission, knowing it would be intercepted, hoping to draw fighter attention away from the main formation and give the bombers a better chance of reaching their target. The plan worked, but it nearly cost the crew of Steel Rain their lives. In the aftermath, each crew member received the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions. The bomber itself, despite the ground crew's heroic repair efforts, never flew again. The damage was simply too extensive. Parts of Steel Rain were salvaged to repair other B-17s, while its riddled fuselage was eventually melted down and the aluminum used to build new aircraft. The legacy of that November mission extended far beyond medals and citations. The engagement demonstrated that well-trained bomber crews could effectively defend themselves, even when isolated from the main formation, a finding that influenced tactical doctrine for the remainder of the air campaign over Europe. For the men who flew that mission, the experience forged bonds that would last a lifetime. Every year, until their deaths, the surviving crew members gathered on November 17 to remember their shared ordeal and honor those who hadn't made it home from other missions. When asked in a 1987 interview what he remembered most about that day, Donovan, by then a retired colonel with silver hair and weathered features, paused before answering. "It wasn't the combat itself," he said finally. "It was watching 10 young Americans, most barely old enough to vote, perform their duties with absolute precision while staring death in the face. That's what I remember. That's what I'll always remember." The story of Steel Rain and its 13 50 caliber machine guns that downed 5 German fighters remains one of the most remarkable defensive actions by a single bomber in the history of aerial warfare. It stands as testimony to the courage, skill, and determination of the young Americans who fought the air war over Europe, a war where each mission was a desperate gamble against increasingly long odds, where survival itself was a form of victory. Wreckage scattered across foreign soil was nothing new to the men of the 8th Air Force by 1944. But what made the scene at Giebelstadt Airfield uniquely haunting was that this debris field consisted entirely of German aircraft. Nearly 70 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters lay strewn across the concrete, their fuselages shattered, wings torn away, and cockpits eerily empty. This wasn't the result of an Allied bombing raid. The Germans themselves had destroyed these fighters, rather than allow them to fall into American hands. First Lieutenant Maurice Greenfield of the 351st Fighter Group stood amid the wreckage, camera in hand, documenting the scene for intelligence purposes. His P-51 Mustang was parked nearby, its machine guns still warm from the morning's combat mission. What struck Greenfield most wasn't the material destruction, but the desperation it represented. Luftwaffe ground crews had meticulously sabotaged each aircraft, rendering them useless to the advancing Allied forces. "They're out of fuel, not planes," Greenfield remarked to his wingman, Captain Raymond Tolliver. "Look at these fighters, brand new, some of them. Never even flew a combat mission." The intelligence briefings had been accurate. By April 1944, Germany's greatest shortage wasn't aircraft or pilots, it was aviation fuel. The strategic bombing campaign against oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants had finally achieved what thousands of air combats could not. It had grounded the Luftwaffe. For the men who had faced those deadly German fighters just months earlier, the irony was profound. The enemy that had once seemed invincible was now crippled not by direct combat, but by the unglamorous work of bombers targeting industrial infrastructure. The crews of planes like Steel Rain had accomplished their mission, though few lived to see the results. Of the original 10-man crew that had survived 11 fighter passes in November 1943, only 7 remained in active service by the spring of 1944. Ball turret gunner Eddie Malinowski had been killed during a mission over Frankfurt when a 20mm shell detonated inside his turret. Radio operator Harold Jenkins and waist gunner Frank Coletti had both been hospitalized after their B-17 took a direct flak hit over Münster, leaving them with injuries that ended their combat careers. For the survivors, the war had transformed from the desperate defensive battles of 1943 to the overwhelming offensive operations of 1944. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs, with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, had changed everything. Now, American fighters prowled the skies over Germany, actively hunting the remaining Luftwaffe interceptors. "You know what's strange?" Tolliver said, kicking at a severed propeller blade. 8 months ago, I'd have given anything to see these planes destroyed. Now it almost feels, I don't know, sad somehow. Greenfield understood exactly what his wingman meant. There was something profoundly melancholy about seeing the remnants of a once formidable enemy. The young German pilots they'd faced, many no older than themselves, had fought with remarkable skill and courage. That these aviators were now grounded, their magnificent machines deliberately broken by their own side, represented a human tragedy that transcended national boundaries. "They were just like us," Greenfield replied softly. "Different uniform, different flag, but the same sky." This recognition that their enemies were humans rather than faceless antagonists was something many Allied airmen came to understand as the war progressed. The aerial battlefield, for all its terror and lethality, retained elements of the chivalric traditions that had characterized the air war of 1914 to 1918. Back at Thorpe Abbotts, the base that Steel Rain had once called home, the remaining members of the original crew received news that changed their perspective forever. Intelligence officers shared captured Luftwaffe records that included detailed accounts of the November 17 engagement from the German perspective. The documents revealed that Hauptmann Wilhelm Meister, leader of the German fighter group that had targeted Steel Rain, had actually commended the American gunners in his after-action report. The defensive fire was extraordinarily accurate and well coordinated, Meister had written. The Americans demonstrated exceptional courage and skill despite being isolated from their formation. Even more remarkably, the report confirmed that 5 German fighters had indeed been shot down during the engagement exactly as the American crew had reported. Meister himself had been forced to break off his attack when 50 caliber rounds damaged his engine cooling system. He had barely managed to glide back to friendly territory before his engine seized completely. "Can you believe that?" Lieutenant James Donovan asked his co-pilot Robert Callahan as they read the translated report in the officers' club. "All this time, I thought intelligence thought we were exaggerating." "What gets me," Callahan replied, "is that this German officer actually praised us, in an official report, no less, could have gotten himself in serious trouble for that." The German records revealed something else that none of the Americans had known. After the engagement, Meister had personally visited the families of 2 of his pilots who had been killed during the attack on Steel Rain. He had told them their sons had died fighting with extraordinary bravery against an enemy that had earned their respect. This revelation affected the American airmen deeply. Throughout their training, they had been conditioned to view the enemy as fanatical Nazis, ideological automatons without humanity or honor. The reality was far more complex. Many Luftwaffe pilots, particularly the veterans who had begun their careers before Hitler's rise to power, maintained a professional ethos that transcended politics. For Navigator Lieutenant Michael Donoghue, this realization brought both comfort and distress. "I've killed men," he confided to the squadron chaplain after reading the report. "Men who weren't so different from me. Men who had families waiting for them, just like I do. How am I supposed to feel about that?" The chaplain, a former infantryman from the First World War, placed a weathered hand on Donoghue's shoulder. "You're supposed to feel exactly what you're feeling," he said quietly. "The day it becomes easy is the day you've lost something essential to your humanity." As the Allied air offensive intensified through the summer of 1944, the bomber crews witnessed the gradual disappearance of German interceptors from the skies over Europe. Missions that once would have faced dozens of fighters now encountered only sporadic resistance. The devastation wrought by strategic bombing became increasingly visible. Entire cities reduced to rubble, industrial regions transformed into cratered moonscapes. The crews of the 8th Air Force found themselves in a psychological paradox. Their survival chances improved dramatically as German defences crumbled, yet the moral burden of their mission grew heavier as they witnessed the consequences of their work. Many bomber crews had convinced themselves they were conducting precision bombing against purely military targets. The reality, visible through their bomb bays and bombardier sights, was far more indiscriminate. For tail gunner Malcolm Reed, the most haunting memory wasn't the aerial combat against German fighters, but a fleeting glimpse of civilians running for shelter during a daylight raid on Hamburg. For just a few seconds, as Steel Rain's replacement aircraft banked away from the target, Reed had seen tiny figures from his altitude scrambling amid the flames and smoke. That momentary connection between bomber and bombed remained with him long after the war ended. In September 1944, during what should have been a routine mission to Stuttgart, Steel Rain 2, the replacement for the original aircraft, encountered what had become an increasingly rare sight: a lone German fighter climbing to intercept their formation. This solitary Messerschmitt, rather than approaching with the standard attack profile, instead pulled alongside the bomber formation at a respectful distance. The pilot waggled his wings in the universal aviation signal for greeting, maintained position for perhaps 30 seconds, then rolled inverted and dived away without firing a single shot. "What the hell was that about?" Donovan asked over the interphone, bewildered by the encounter. None of the crew had an answer until weeks later, when intelligence officers connected this incident to a growing pattern of similar encounters across the European theatre. Some German pilots, recognizing the inevitability of defeat and personally disillusioned with the Nazi regime, had begun making these symbolic gestures of professional respect. Unable to openly defy orders to intercept Allied bombers, they found this method of signaling their individual humanity amidst the industrial slaughter of modern warfare. These rare moments of connection across enemy lines became treasured, memories for the airmen who experienced them, brief glimpses of a shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of nations and ideologies. Years later, these would be the stories they told their grandchildren, long after the technical details of combat had faded from memory. By January 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved what many had thought impossible just 2 years earlier: near-complete air superiority over Germany. Luftwaffe fighter units had been decimated, their fuel supplies exhausted, their experienced pilots killed or captured. The skies belonged to the Allies. The surviving members of Steel Rain's original crew completed their 25 mission tours and returned to the United States as the instructors training the next generation of airmen. They carried with them not just combat experience, but the complex moral legacy of their participation in history's first truly industrial air war. Flight engineer Walter Novak found himself teaching cadets at Keesler Field, Mississippi, struggling to convey the reality of combat to young men who still imagined aerial warfare as a glamorous adventure. "Forget everything you've seen in the newsreels," he told each new class. "It's not about glory or medals. It's about keeping the man next to you alive long enough to get home." For Bombardier William Hayes, the psychological transition to civilian life proved almost impossible. The precision of his work dropping bombs had been a source of professional pride during the war. In peacetime, those same skills, the mathematical calculations, the split-second timing, the detached technical precision, had no application. More troubling were the nightmares in which he saw the consequences of his accuracy from ground level rather than from 25,000 feet. Hayes eventually found purpose working with other veterans struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The ones who adjust best, he observed in a 1952 letter to Donovan, are those who can acknowledge both the necessity of what we did and the terrible cost of it. It's the ones who can't hold those contradictions in their minds who suffer the most. The reunions began in 1947, just 2 years after the war ended. At first, it was just the original crew of Steel Rain, gathering in Chicago at the Palmer House Hotel. By 1950, the reunion had expanded to include crews from the entire 100th Bomb Group. As the decades passed, these gatherings evolved from boisterous celebrations of survival to more solemn commemorations of sacrifice. At the 1973 reunion, now held annually at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, the remaining crew members of Steel Rain witnessed something none of them had expected: the arrival of 3 former Luftwaffe pilots who had flown against them during that November 1943 mission. The meeting was initially awkward, decades of conditioning difficult to overcome even 30 years after the conflict. But over drinks and dinner, the former adversaries discovered they had far more in common than they had differences. They had all been young men thrust into an aerial war of unprecedented scale and lethality. They had all lost friends. They had all wrestled with the moral complexity of their service. "I shot at your aircraft that day," admitted former Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Becker, now a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. "I don't know if my rounds hit you, but I tried my best to kill you." "And I tried to kill you right back," replied Malcolm Reed, extending his hand across the table. "Good thing we were both terrible shots." The laughter that followed broke the final barrier between them. By evening's end, American and German airmen were exchanging addresses and promising to correspond. Several maintained friendships that lasted until their deaths. What struck many observers of these reunions was how quickly the former enemies found common ground, while civilians who had never experienced combat often maintained more rigid animosities. The shared experience of aerial warfare had created a bond that transcended national identity, a brotherhood of the air that recognized courage and skill, regardless of the insignia on the aircraft. The story of Steel Rain and its 1350 calibers became part of 8th Air Force lore, retold at each reunion with slight embellishments and adjustments as memories faded, and the need for meaning grew stronger than the need for absolute historical accuracy. The human mind seeks narrative coherence, especially when processing traumatic events, and the veterans were no exception. But the essential truth remained consistent. A single B-17, isolated from its formation, had endured 11 separate fighter attacks and shot down 5 German interceptors before limping home with over 300 bullet holes in its airframe. The odds against such an outcome were astronomical. That it happened at all seemed to demand some greater meaning beyond the statistical probabilities of combat. For James Donovan, who eventually rose to the rank of Brigadier General before retiring in 1969, that meaning came in the form of an unexpected correspondence in 1982. A package arrived at his Florida retirement home containing photographs of the wreckage of a Messerschmitt 109, along with a letter from a German historical society documenting aircraft excavations. The fighter had been piloted by Lieutenant Hans Weiss, one of the 5 German airmen shot down during the engagement with Steel Rain. Unlike the other 4, Weiss had not been killed immediately. He had managed to crash-land his damaged fighter in a field near Bremen, but died of his wounds before help arrived. Among his personal effects, preserved by his family and eventually donated to the Historical Society, was his final letter. poem written the night before the mission. In it, Weiss had expressed doubt about Germany's prospects in the war and moral qualms about the regime he was serving. "I fly because I must," he had written, "and because I will not abandon my comrades. But I no longer believe in final victory, nor in the righteousness of our cause." For Donovan, this revelation completed a circle of understanding that had begun nearly 40 years earlier. The men who had tried to shoot him from the sky had not been the fanatical Nazis of propaganda posters. They had been complex individuals with their own doubts, fears, and moral compasses, just as he and his crew had been. In the end, Donovan wrote in his memoir published shortly before his death in 1990, "What I learned from the war wasn't about tactics or strategy or even courage. It was about the terrible price we all pay when we allow ideologues and fanatics to divide us. The young men I fought against weren't so different from the young men I fought alongside. That's the tragedy of war, and that's why we must work tirelessly to ensure the next generation doesn't repeat our mistakes." The last reunion of Steel Rain crew members took place in 2004, marking the 61st anniversary of their historic mission. Only 3 remained alive: co-pilot Robert Callahan, navigator Michael Donoghue, and waist gunner Daniel Witkowski. All were in their 80s, their once youthful faces now mapped with the lines of long and mostly peaceful lives. They gathered at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, where a restored B-17 painted with Steel Rain markings was on permanent display. Museum curators had created an exhibit about their November 1943 mission, complete with photographs, personal effects, and a 3-dimensional map showing the aerial engagement. As the 3 veterans stood beneath the massive bomber, surrounded by admiring museum visitors seeking autographs and photographs, Witkowski turned to his former crewmates with tears in his eyes. "You know what gets me?" he said quietly. "All those years ago, I thought the point was to survive the war. Turns out that was just the beginning. The real mission was what we did with the time they didn't get." He gestured toward the exhibit, which included photographs of the 7 crew members who had already passed away. "We lived for them too. Every day was a gift they didn't receive." Callahan nodded slowly. "I think about that German kid, sometimes the one whose fighter I hit. He never got to go home, never had children or grandchildren, never saw another summer, all because I did my job well that day. And if you hadn't," Donoghue replied, "it would have been you who never went home. That's the brutal equation of war. There's no escaping it." The 3 men stood in silence, each lost in his own memories. Around them, museum visitors continued to snap photos and examine exhibits, most unable to truly comprehend what these elderly men had experienced as young airmen. "The thing is," Witkowski said finally, "I don't think I'd trade those 25 missions for anything. Not because of some misplaced nostalgia for combat, God knows there's nothing to romanticize about watching your friends die, but because those months taught me everything I needed to know about what matters." "Like what?" asked a teenage boy who had been listening nearby, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. Witkowski smiled at the young man. "That courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's necessary despite your fear. That the bonds between people matter more than any ideology or national boundary. That life is simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than you can possibly imagine until you've seen both extremes. And most importantly," Callahan added, "that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, but transforming him into your friend." As the afternoon waned and the museum prepared to close, the 3 veterans made their way slowly toward the exit, leaning on canes and each other for support. Their war had ended 61 years earlier, but its lessons continued to resonate through their lives and the lives of all who heard their story. The aerial battle over Bremen in 1943 had lasted less than 20 minutes. Its reverberations continued for generations. Steel Rain and its 1350 caliber machine guns had become more than just a remarkable statistic in the historical record of the air war over Europe. It had become a testament to the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to rise above their circumstances when facing the ultimate test. In the museum's quiet research library, a leather-bound guest book contained the signatures of visitors who had come to learn about the bomber and its crew. Among them, inscribed in the careful handwriting of an elderly man, was a quote from William Faulkner that perhaps best captured the enduring significance of what those young airmen had accomplished. They are not dead who live in the hearts they leave behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.